So many people have different levels of fitness. Some people are professional athletes, of course, but most people are not. Many people exercise regularly. Some people are trying to do that more. Some people are doing too much of that. They're overtraining. They're not recovering enough. If we were to take a step back and each and every one of us ask, how fit are we? With the word fit, of course, being a very broad encompassing word. It could encompass endurance, certainly it does, strength, the ability to run fast, even if for short distances. It might even include hypertrophy or directed hypertrophy, trying to balance one's musculature to offset asymmetries, recover from injuries, etc. How should I, or anyone else for that matter, think about their level of fitness? I know my resting heart rate, but what do I do in terms of really assessing whether or not I'm as fit as I could be and should be, both for sake of health and performance? And here I'm asking you the question not as an athlete, but as somebody who's been pretty consistent as an exerciser. But if we were to throw our arms around this question of how do we assess our fitness, what would be sort of the different levels of assessment that we should think about and do?
When it comes to exercise, people generally have two major goals in mind. Goal number one is achieving some sort of appearance, right? This is, I want to be big, or I want to not be too big, or I want to be lean, something, right? It doesn't matter what that goal is, but there is an aesthetic component to almost everybody. They want to look a certain way or not look a certain way. The other one is functionality. So I want to be able to perform a certain way. Now, again, that definition differs per person. So I want to be better at strength. I want to be better at mobility. I want to be able to have energy throughout the day, whatever it is. So there's some sort of appeal to aesthetic, and there's some sort of appeal to functionality. So within both of those categories, we want to be in a position where we can understand, where do I need to go with my exercise training so that I can be as fit and as healthy and achieve these goals that I want now, as well as be in a position where I can maintain them for a long period of time. So this blends both immediate goals. So say you're just interested in squatting a lot of weight. Say you're interested in running a 5K time the best you want. It doesn't matter. It blends that with the ability, the desire to have a long wellness span, to be fit throughout life, to achieve all those things for as long as possible. So then the question kind of comes back to saying, well, how do I know which area I need to focus on the most? And why am I not achieving these goals? Or how can I get there more effectively? And if we look at the big picture, we have to understand that there are several major components to physical fitness that are going to be required in all of these categories. And to achieve that, there are a handful of components that have to happen to be able to hit those goals. Now, there are infinite methods. So the saying we actually use here a lot is, the methods are many, but the concepts are few. So what I'd love to do today is, over the course of our discussion, is hit exactly what those concepts are, and then cover a whole bunch of different methods, and we could do that for hours. But we'll cover a number of them for various goals.
So one of the reasons I went into neuroscience and not into exercise science is because of this thing, neuroplasticity, the nervous system's ability to adapt. But the more time I spend with you and the more I learn from you, I realize that many, if not all of the organ systems of our body have this incredible ability to adapt. And when we're talking about physical exercise, there are incredible adaptations that, of course, involve the nervous system, but also involve muscle and connective tissue and so many other cell types and tissues. That said, when we talk about fitness, what are the major types of adaptations that underlie this thing that we call fitness? And later, I know we're going to get into how different forms of exercise can trigger different types of adaptations. But what are the major adaptations that one can create in their body using exercise?
There are many reasons why one should exercise, and we could perhaps cover that later in our chats. But the physiological adaptations can be bucketed really into 9 areas. So the very first one is what I call skill or technique. So just learning to move better, more efficiently, with a specific position and timing and sequence or whatever that is. This could be running more effectively. This could be practicing a skill like shooting a ball or an implement, swinging a golf club, anything like that. I call that skill development. The second one is speed. So this is simply moving at a higher velocity or with a better rate of acceleration. Okay, that's very similar to the next one, which is power. And power is speed multiplied by force. The next one then, of course, on top of that is force or strength. So those are really synonymous terms, right? How effectively can you move something? Now, this is often confused, strength rather, as muscular endurance. So what I mean by that is strength truly is a marker of what's the maximum thing you can move, or what's the maximum amount of force you can produce one time. It's not how many repetitions in a row you can do. That's actually another one of our adaptations called muscular endurance. All right, so that is typically under the order of say 5 to 25, maybe 50 repetitions. Think of a classic, how many push-ups can you do in a row? How many sit-ups can you do in a minute? Things like that are muscular endurance. Muscular endurance tends to be localized. So this is, specific to just say your triceps and your deltoids. It's not a overall cardiovascular endurance marker or anything like that. So that's strength, number 4. Number 5 is muscle hypertrophy. And this is the first time now we're talking about an appearance rather than a functional outcome. So, moving better, moving faster, moving heavier are indicators of how well you can move. This is the first one that's just simply how big is your muscle, and that's muscle hypertrophy or muscle size. After that is muscular endurance. So this is how many repetitions you can typically do of a movement. So think of how many push-ups in a row you can do, how many sit-ups in a minute you can do, things that are typically in 5 to 50 repetition sort of range. And it is often, or it is almost always, local muscle. So what I mean by that is, a push-up test is really how many reps that your triceps and pecs and deltoids can do. It is not a cardiovascular endurance. It is not a global physiological endurance. It's specific to typically one or a few muscle groups at a time. And this is why you have to do multiple tests for sort of every group there. After that, now we've moved into number 7, which is what I call anaerobic capacity. This is more synonymous with maximum heart rate. And now we're actually looking at, rather than a single movement or muscle group, it is a total physiological limitation. So it is the maximum amount of work you can do in, say, 30 to 45 seconds, maybe even up to 120 seconds of all-out work. Think of your classic interval type of stuff here. So how much work can you do at a maximum rate where you're going to enter tremendous amounts of global fatigue? The next past that is maximal aerobic capacity. And this is probably something like in the 8 to 15 minute range, where you're going to reach probably both a maximum heart rate as well as a true VO2 max, which we'll talk a lot more about what that is later. So that is different from the previous one, where you can't reach this in a matter of seconds. It simply takes multiple minutes to get to a position to where your VO2 max is actually going to be sufficiently challenged, or an indicator there. And then the last one, number 9, is what I call long duration. And this is just your ability to sustain sub-maximal work for a long period of time with no breaks, no reductions whatsoever. This is often called steady state training, or a lot of people just think of this when they think of quote unquote cardio. But your ability to continue movement without any breaks or change or drop is the last and final adaptation.
And for long distance steady state, I'm guessing it exceeds 15 minutes because the previous one was 8 to 15 minutes or so. What sort of time ranges are we talking about in terms of this long duration?
Well, that's actually wonderful. You're going to be anything past 15 minutes. So really, if you look at a kind of a minimal number there, it's generally 20 minutes of what we're looking for. But a more typical would be 20 to 60 minutes. But anything past that would still be limited by your long duration endurance. So your ability to sustain work over time.
Okay, so given that there are 9 different major adaptations that can be induced with exercise of specific types, is there any one global test or assessment that people can take or do that allows them to determine what level of ability, of fitness they have in each and every one of these 9 different categories?
There are probably dozens or more tests that you can do for each one of those 9 categories. And what I would actually like to do is walk you through my favorites for each, and giving you both the scientific gold standards. So if you had the ability, unlimited resources, what should you go do? As well as some that are equipment free, that are cost free, things that anyone can do across the world. In addition to that, I want to walk you through what those numbers should be. How do you identify if you're really poor in something or if you're great? And then if you aren't as good, maybe in a category and you want to get better at it, exactly what to do in terms of protocols for how to achieve optimal results in each of those steps.
So I noticed in your list of the 9 different adaptations to exercise that you did not mention fat loss or health promoting benefits, which are 2 reasons that a lot of people exercise. Was there a specific reason that you did not mention those?
Absolutely. It's because those things are actually not specific training styles. They are byproducts of these 9. So what I mean by that is if you understand how fat loss occurs, which we can certainly talk about, you'll realize some of these 9 protocols are effective for fat loss and some are not. General health is the same thing. When we understand what it actually means to be healthy from a physiological perspective, then the rationale for what to train for is going to determine itself. So what I mean is looking at things like, in order to be healthy, you have to have sufficient strength, you have to have cardiovascular fitness, you have to have sufficient muscle, and etc. Therefore, training for one's health is determined by those restrictions. So for you, Andrew, you may need to do more strength training to be healthy. Where me, because I'm strong already, way stronger than you, I may not need to do as much strength training. So our quote unquote health-based protocols are based on our current status or limitations in physical fitness among these 9 areas. So what I would like to do today is to cover a brief history of exercise science. And the reason is it's going to explain a lot about why people are not getting the goals in their exercise programs that they want, as well as give you very specific direction about what to do instead.
Do you have any examples of studies in or outside the laboratory that point to that in a concrete way?
If you look across the literature, and this is actually back to as early as the mid-1950s. In fact, it actually goes back to previous to that, to the Harvard Fatigue Lab, 1927 to 1947 area. People actually were advocating at that point a combination of strength training and endurance.
In the 1920s?
Way back then. In fact, it actually goes prior to that, in the late 1880s. There's scientific evidence back then. It became more well-developed in the mid-1950s and 60s. In fact, there was the initial stages of what's called the exercise as medicine movement, which is the movement now, but the initial stages of that actually root back to the 1950s. And I could actually go into that whole discussion and the story of how that all came about. But that's the health is wealth mantra that came from the 1950s, from the scientific community then. All those data points are going to suggest you need a combination of some sort of broad strength training and broad endurance thing. Now, if you have a specific goal 5 months from now, you want to compete in a race or hit a certain physique thing, that's fine to focus on one area of training. Certainly if you're an athlete, that's different. But if you want to maximize health and overall functionality throughout time, it needs to be a combination. And to really, really highlight this, I can actually talk about a couple of studies that I've done. One of them we actually did in Stockholm, Sweden. So I did this at the Karolinska Institute, which you probably are aware of. It's actually one of the founding places of all of exercise physiology. Generally, it started there. It was called something different back then, but really, our entire field came out of Stockholm and the Karolinska Institute. And we worked with a whole bunch of cross-country skiers that were in their 80s and 90s. And so they were competitive skiers in the 1940s and 50s, and they had been skiing competitively for that entire duration. So you're talking 50 to 60 consecutive years of competing. So these are 80 to 90-year-olds living alone and healthy, and we compared them to a group of individuals here in America who are the same age, but were not exercising. And what we wanted to do is to see and kind of look at what are these lifelong endurance individuals? What do they look like? When we brought them into the lab, which is, by the way, amazing to do a VO2 max test on a 92-year-old, especially in a language that they don't speak. And you can imagine you're doing this in the hospital, right? And you're running people through, this is a cycling test. And so for a VO2 max test, you have a mask on your face. You're hooked up to a metabolic cart so we can collect all the gases that are coming out of your mouth. And you're chanting these people on, and basically every minute the workload gets harder and harder and harder until you can't complete it. And we're doing this in a cardiology center, and the cardiologists are usually waiting for their heart rate to get like slightly elevated, and they stop them because they're 85, 86 years old. And not only are we not stopping them, but we are screaming in their ears, just like, go, go, go.
In Swedish or English?
In English, right? And then the translator, but it doesn't take a lot of translation when someone's screaming at your face, like, go, go, go. So we ran them through a whole bunch of VO2 max tests. And we did the same thing for those folks back here in America. And what was incredibly clear from that study was the VO2 max. You can think about these numbers, and this is what's called relative. So in the relative terms are milliliters per kilogram per minute. And so a standard number is about 18 is what we call the line of independence. So if your VO2 max is below 18 milliliters per kilogram per minute, it's very hard for you to live by yourself. So your fitness is so low, you probably are going to need to have somebody living with you, or you'll need to be in some sort of assisted living home. The VO2 max of 20 or 21 or 22, you're not below that line of independence, but you're on that threshold. And so what we found was our folks here in America, the group average was right around that number. So they were living at home by definition. We picked them to be people living by themselves in their 80s and not in a living room. But they didn't have any bandwidth. So if they got a cold or they had anything pop up where they lost a little bit of fitness, they were going to drop below that line and would probably have to go to some sort of assisted living situation. The folks in Stockholm, the cross-country skiers, the group average was most closer to like 35 to 38 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Now that number is about the VO2 max you would find for a normal college male. And so these folks that were literally 80 or 90, if the joke, if a saber-toothed tiger ran in the room or whatever and it chased it down and we all had to run to see who didn't get eaten alive, the college men would probably have gotten eaten before the 90-year-olds. And in one case, we had a 92-year-old individual, and I think his VO2 max was 38, which was, in our estimation, a world record, the highest VO2 max for somebody over the age of 90.
May I ask, what is a typical resting heart rate for somebody very fit, like these older Swedish cross-country skiers? If somebody has let's say their number is 35 milliliters per kilogram in this VO2 max test, but since most of us don't have access to that kind of equipment, but we can measure our pulse rate.
Yep.
What was a typical resting pulse rate?
Sub 60.
Sub 60.
Yeah. I mean, typically that's a good number to go off of for anybody, regardless of age. Anytime I see somebody above that, I'm going to start asking questions. Certainly above, you'll see in the literature, people will say 60 to 80 is normal, and I don't agree with that at all. If your resting heart rate is 75 beats per minute, there's either something going on or you're not fit.
How much cross-country skiing were they doing on average in the previous, let's say, if we take the previous 20 years, since they'd been long-time cross-country skiers, divide that by 20 years.
Yeah.
On average, are these people cross-country skiing 5 hours a day, 2 hours a day, an hour a day?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. I don't remember. It's been many years, but they were not doing it every single day, and the volume would not have shocked you. It was the consistency over 50 years that got them there. Now, obviously, these people were, again, world champions and Olympic gold medalists in the 1940s and 50s, so they were elite. They just continued consistently over time. But it wasn't a shocking amount of physical fitness. They also didn't go out of their way to train hard. They were busy chopping wood, they were busy doing a number of other things, and then they just happened to do some of these races and ski along the way. But it wasn't a crazy amount to where you're like, oh, that's great, but I could never hit that number. It was something much more reasonable.
So is the takeaway to be consistent about getting cardiovascular exercise? And we can define what consistent means in terms of days per week a little bit later, and I know we will.
Yeah.
What are some other examples? I love these examples of from the real world.
So here's the downside, though. So I only told you about their VO2 max. What I didn't tell you about is their leg strength and functionality. And that part was no more superior than it was their counterparts who were not exercisers. So what that showed really, really clearly, and many other studies have been done since then that look at the classic, what we call lifelong endurance exercisers. You will see in general their VO2 max, their cardiovascular function, their resting heart rate, their blood pressure. It will be markedly healthier than folks who don't exercise. It is extraordinarily clear that type of exercise is very important for chronic disease management. No doubt about it. However, it is not sufficient for overall global health because it does almost nothing for leg strength, for any other marker of health, which we can talk about what are the things that are actually going to predict mortality, morbidity the most. So that was a big smashing indication that's like, hey, this is great. However, you're leaving things on the table for your overall health. Now, one could argue they're 80 and they're doing pretty well, but they weren't doing as well in these areas. And so a study we did later, actually, as a follow-up, was looking at monozygous twins.
For those that don't know, monozygotes are identical twins.
Yeah, which is interesting. So you basically have, what I'm setting up here is this is the perfect exercise scientific experiment. Monozygous identical twins mean they have the exact same DNA. So an egg was fertilized, split, and then 2 humans grew out of that with the exact same DNA. And so now we can start answering the question, well, yeah, okay, what about maybe these cross-country skiers? Maybe they were just genetic freaks. Maybe it didn't matter. It's like some people have, well, genetics are always a component to it, but how much? Well, now we have a scenario lining up where it's like, wait a minute, you have monozygous twins. So we have a replica of a human being, exact same DNA. The only differences that we would see in their physiology now would be due to lifestyle circumstances. Interesting. So, monozygous twin, your dad and uncle, right? Great. Do they exercise? Well, one of them does. He's a lifelong endurance exercise. Runner, cyclist, swimmer, Ironman, all these things. What about the other one? Nope, he doesn't exercise at all. And so I wanted to actually, going back to the model that was first developed by the Harvard Fatigue Lab, one thing that's interesting about that community is they started off with the concept of trying to examine human performance through a holistic lens. And so it was the antithesis of looking at either organ by organ. So we're going to only look at the cardiovascular system. We're only going to look at skeletal muscle. And then we're saying we're looking at this entire picture. And so that model we wanted to carry through in these twins. And I said, all right, I want to bring them in the lab, but I'm not just going to look at one system. I want to do everything. So we took stool samples, we took blood, we did vertical jump tests, we did maximum strength tests, we did MRIs of muscle mass, we did VO2 max tests, we did efficiency stuff, we did genetic testing, we did an IQ test, we did psychological battery. We wanted to look at everything to figure out of these things what differ between the twins. And if so, the second key question there is, by how much? So can I improve my VO2 max? Sure, everyone knows that, but how much? Can it change by 5%, 80%? Like, where's the number? And so putting some quantification on this was very important. And so, again, we had another example of a classic endurance-only training paradigm compared to a non. Actually, so this is a person who's, I think he's a truck driver by vocation, which is, I think actually he drove for a potato chip company, which was even funnier. The endurance athlete actually was great because, like any endurance people, he had physical books of all of his training mileage for the last 35 years. And we just went through them and we calculated the total amount of miles he ran, his averages, his heart rates per time. We had this unbelievable thing, like what races he was in. He had the documentation. It was just totally nuts, right? Like something that endurance people are like shaking their head right now going, oh yeah, I got that too. And everyone else
endurance
is like,
folks are pretty nerdy.
Yeah, they're super nerdy, right? So it was great because now we could validate as close as one could to actually how much he ran and things like that. So they had about a 35-year discord. They both exercised up through high school. About 18, they stopped doing it. And by the time we brought them in the lab, they're in their mid-50s. So it was about 35 years of difference. And when we ran them through the testing, if you look at the measures that were similar to the Sweden study, it was almost identical. The exercising twin was significantly better at things like a lipid panel, resting heart rate, blood pressure, VO2 max. Any of those markers, as predicted, were much better. What was very interesting, though, was the things that were in the middle. First of all, their total amount of muscle mass was almost identical, like to the gram, within the margin of error of a DEXA scan could possibly ever be. The non-exerciser, though, was a little bit fatter. So the difference in actual body weight was explained almost entirely by body fat, or non-lean tissue, really. Same sort of deal. So, okay, like no one's surprised there that the exerciser was a little bit leaner, even though it didn't change total amount of muscle mass at all. When we looked at some of the more functional tests, and we looked at things like muscle quality. So this is a metric you can get from an ultrasound. You can kind of think about this as how much fat is inside the tissue, which is sometimes an advantage for an endurance athlete to have a little bit more of what are called intramuscular triglycerides because it's a fuel directly in the tissue. But in general, the exercise or the muscle quality was not in favor of the exerciser. If you looked at the performance testing and if you looked at strength, it favored the non-exerciser. And so now again, we have the same finding we saw in our Sweden study, but in identical twins. And so it really, really highlighted the fact that if you want to move forward with optimal health, simply picking one silo is not going to get you there.
One silo meaning just running, just cycling.
Right.
Does this mean that the twin that did not exercise could jump higher or win an arm wrestling competition. Not that that's a vital thing to be able to do, but just in terms of measuring strength, sort of isometric strength, was the non-exercising twin stronger, or at least as strong as their exercising twin?
Yes, particularly in grip strength. Yep. And any of the measures, like the vertical jump, leg extension power, and a number of things, they often favored the non-exerciser, which you're still a little bit of a chicken and egg. You don't know if necessarily the endurance training reduced that other twin's strength, or it doesn't even really matter per se. I think the highlight of it is, can you change some of these metrics of VO2 max? Yeah, not even close. These things are very responsive regardless of your genetics. Your genetics will give you a starting place very clearly. Even the non-exerciser was a pretty healthy guy. So they were in a good spot. He's mid-50s, doesn't exercise, doesn't really pay attention to his diet at all, and he was in a pretty good shape. However, if you want to actually move progress and move forward high functionality, you have to do something besides just run, right? Just distance run. Now, I could say the same thing for strength training. That alone, because I don't want to make this seem like I'm saying endurance exercises, it worked. In both these studies, those folks were much better off in metrics that are incredibly important to mortality, how long you're going to live, VO2 max, etc. It's just not going to get there in terms of strength. We took a look at muscle fiber physiology as well, which is very interesting. So what I mean is there's generally two types of muscle fibers, fast twitch and slow twitch. And one of the things that is a hallmark of aging is a selective reduction in fast twitch fibers. And that's because it's difficult to activate them unless you're doing high force activities. You're going to activate slow twitch fibers doing almost any activity of daily living. And so they stay around. Fast twitch fibers, unless you're doing something of high force, are going to not be used, and they're not going to be kept around. And that's a problem because when you look at things like the need for leg strength through aging, the ability to catch yourself from a fall, these things are incredibly important. If you don't have fast twitch fibers, you don't have the speed to get your foot out in front of you on time, and you don't have the eccentric strength to stop the fall from happening. And so if you look across, again, the aging literature, they're very clear about the importance of maintaining strength and fast twitch fibers over time. So we know that this is an important distinction here overall. And people will often talk about, okay, how much of that is genetically determined? Can I change my fiber type? And the answer there is resoundingly yes. And can I change it with exercise? And the answer is absolutely you can. And then the next question is, well, how much? So now, again, we're going to see an order of magnitude. In general, without going too far down an area that maybe we could save for later, each one of your muscles in your body has a different percentage of fast twitch and slow twitch. For example, your calf. If you look at your soleus, which is kind of the smaller one that goes in the back, that's generally mostly slow twitch, typically 80% or so slow twitch. The gastroc, which is the other one right next to it, so if you were to point your toe next to your face and that part that kind of flexes out in the middle, pops out, that's your gastroc. That is almost the inverse. So it's generally 80% fast twitch, maybe 20% slow twitch. Generally anything anti-postural, or anti-gravity, spinal erectors, things that are meant to keep you up or moving all day are going to be slow twitch, and things like your hamstrings, which are for explosion, are going to be fast twitch. Well, we biopsied the quad in these individuals, and in that muscle, it's generally about 50-50, fast twitch, slow twitch, as a really broad number. Well, one of the things that we found was in the non-exerciser, it was almost textbook what you would predict. It was about 50% or so slow twitch, a little bit of percentage of fast twitch, and then about 20% of what are these called hybrid fibers, which are a hallmark of inactivity. All right, great. In the exerciser, it was about 95% slow twitch. And so it's extremely clear. Again, I don't know if maybe their set point was a little bit higher towards that, and the non-exerciser devolved down to his place or the other one, but it doesn't matter. I mean, you're going from 40% slow twitch in one case to 95% slow twitch in another case. It shows you that the limits of physiological adaptation are darn near boundless given enough exposure. And in this case, 35 years of extremely consistent training, and his muscle morphology was completely different than his identical twin with the exact same DNA.
Those are two beautiful examples of people doing endurance work for a number of years and what that gives them in terms of benefits and functionality. Has the opposite experiment been done or observed where somebody just weightlifted or just sprinted for a number of years I don't know that there's a identical twin control. That's a little.
I wish we had a third twin.
Too much to ask for, right? Triplets. Okay, so triplets out there. If you're exercising in different ways, or people who have triplets, maybe you assign one kid to be a runner, one kid to be a weightlifter, and the other one to be sedentary. Please don't do experiments like that. But the expectation, as I understand it, would be that the person that sprints or that does heavy squats, explosive work, would then have more fast twitch muscle fibers in their quad, and their non-exercising counterpart would have fewer. That would make sense. But what happens if you assess the endurance level in somebody who's just done strength training or just sprinted?
Yep. So we don't have those data specifically. We're actually just starting to have studies come out on lifelong strength trainers. And there's actually a very good reason for this, which is a whole story we can get into. But the quick answer is we don't have a lot of people who've been lifting weights for 30 or plus years. We have a whole swath of people who've been doing endurance training for that long.
Is that because fewer people have been weight training, or are the weight trainers all dead?
You got to go back to the 1953, 1954. You had two major things happen that changed the entire course of exercise physiology and exercise science, and really exercise as we know it. It's important to understand the history of our field. A lot of the questions I get are based on false assumptions of what exercise can and can't do. As an example, questions like momentum. Should I use momentum, or that's cheating, right? Or it doesn't work, it compromises my results. It's actually totally untrue. There are excellent reasons when you should use momentum when you lift. There are reasons when you should not. It is sometimes very beneficial to go fast with your exercise repetitions. Sometimes very slow and controlled is better. Any question I get, in fact, I'm very infamous for always responding with, it depends. The reason I say it depends is it depends on the goal. When you're training for speed or power or muscular endurance, the answer to some of these very common questions differs. What people fail to realize is they think they're asking the right question because they don't understand this history, what's being planted in your brain subconsciously is driving that question, and it's not necessarily the right one. So if we walk through that a little bit, you'll see what that field has led you, why you think certain things matter when they actually don't, or maybe your assumptions are incorrect, and then exactly what to do about them.